Sunridge Ranch stretched endlessly across the dry Texas plains. A sprawling estate where silence reigned, broken only by the rustling wind and the occasional low moan of the cattle grazing lazily in the fields. The sprawling land had once been full of life and laughter. But now, it seemed just as empty as the. Ethan Carter stood in the doorway of his barn, eyes narrowing against the harsh morning sun as he surveyed his ranch. His hands, rough and calloused from years of hard work, rested against his hips. He had built this place from the ground up. But lately, it had become just another reminder of the life he had lost. The life he had once shared with his beloved wife, Caroline. Caroline had been the light of his world, her laughter, her spirit, her warmth. They had dreamt of raising children together, of watching their family grow alongside the crops and cattle on the ranch. But fate had a cruel way of rewriting plans. When Caroline had fallen ill, their perfect world had come crashing down. The doctors had said it was just a small pain at first, a passing discomfort, but it quickly spiraled into something far worse. Cancer. Aggressive. Terminal. Ethan had fought for her with every last bit of strength he had. Spending fortunes on doctors, specialists, and experimental treatments. Desperate to save her, he had watched her wither away, helpless, unable to do anything to stop the pain. And when she finally passed, Ethan's world went dark. The ranch that had once been a place of hope and growth became nothing more than a hollow shell. An empty reminder of everything he had lost. His friends, his neighbors, even his family, everyone had faded away as he isolated himself in his grief. The once vibrant man who had laughed and planned for the future was now a shadow, walking through life with a weight that no one could see but that weighed him down every moment. But there was still one living thing left on the ranch that made Ethan feel connected to the past. Luna, his mixed-breed dog. She had been Caroline's gift to him on one of their trips into town years ago. Luna had come into their lives when they were still so full of hope. And now she was the only one who stayed by his side. Always loyal, always there. The bond between them had become the only thing that gave Ethan any sense of purpose. Luna had been with him through it all, the loneliness, the emptiness, the silence. And now, Luna was expecting pups. Ethan found himself focusing on her, giving her attention as if she could fill the hole that Caroline had left. He never thought much about it at first, it was a distraction. Something to care for. He prepared a special place for Luna to give birth, made sure she was comfortable, and checked on her every day. But as the weeks passed, Luna grew rounder, her movements slower, and Ethan found himself anticipating the arrival of the puppies more and more. It was on one such morning, while making his rounds on the ranch, that Ethan first noticed Luna was missing from her usual spot in the barn. His heart skipped a beat. He knew it wasn't like her to wander off, especially so close to giving birth. He grabbed his hat, his boots, and stepped outside, the wind kicking up dust as he scanned the land. The silence felt louder now, the weight of loneliness pressing harder on him. He walked toward the barn, calling Luna's name softly. The empty ranch felt even emptier as he moved through the familiar surroundings. A place that had once been filled with the sounds of his wife's voice, the laughter of children he would never have, and the joy of a life they had built together. As he approached the barn, Ethan saw a trail of fresh, dark spots on the ground. His heart sank. Blood, and it was leading straight to the barn door. Panic surged through him, but he pushed it down, reminding himself to stay calm. He wasn't sure what he would find, but he knew he had to be ready for anything. When he opened the barn door, Ethan's eyes widened. Luna was lying in the straw, her body trembling from exhaustion. Around her, there were several small bodies moving, puppies. But one of them was different. It wasn't like the others. It was small, fragile, and human. The baby's tiny hand reached out, grasping Luna's fur, and for a moment, everything around Ethan seemed to disappear. His mind tried to make sense of what he was seeing, but it couldn't. He knelt slowly, as if the scene before him were some kind of dream, unable to believe it was real. A human baby, alive and well, lying beside Luna, as though she had given birth to him. The room spun as he took another step forward. His breath caught in his throat. How was this possible? How could it be real? His thoughts were interrupted by a soft rustling from the corner of the barn. Someone, or something, was hiding there, watching. Ethan froze. The world around him felt surreal, as if time itself had slowed to a crawl. And in that moment, he knew his life would never be the same. The shocking discovery continued. Ethan's heart raced as he knelt beside the tiny human baby. His hand hovered over the fragile form, unsure of what to do next. He had seen death up close. But this was beyond comprehension. How could this be happening? How could Luna, his dog, a loyal companion, have given birth to a human child? It didn't make sense. Not in any way. The baby's tiny eyes opened, blinking at the sunlight filtering through the barn's wooden slats. It let out a small whimper, its tiny hand curling into a fist, reaching out instinctively, as if searching for comfort. Luna, exhausted but alert, licked the child with a tenderness that seemed to defy the natural order of things. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The dog, once his sole source of company and comfort, had taken on an almost maternal role, looking at the baby as though it were her own. The bond between them was undeniable. But the reality of the situation, this impossible reality, left Ethan paralyzed. For a long moment, he could only stare at the two of them. The barn was still, save for the soft sounds of the newborn puppies and the baby's occasional whimper. The emptiness that had consumed his life for the past few years seemed to fill the space around him. The weight of the situation pressing down on his chest. What was he supposed to do now? He had heard of strange phenomena, of inexplicable events. But this felt different. This was real. In front of him, undeniable. And the silence in the barn grew heavy, the weight of the unknown bearing down on him. Then, a faint rustling sound came from the shadows at the far end of the barn. Ethan's head snapped toward it. His senses heightened. He instinctively reached for his rifle, though he knew the movement wasn't necessary. The air in the barn seemed to thicken, tension rising like an invisible wall. "Who's there?" Ethan called out, his voice firm but edged with unease. The barn was large, and the shadows deep. He couldn't be sure who or what had made the noise. His instincts told him it wasn't an animal. It was human. From behind a stack of hay bales, a figure emerged, a woman. She looked disheveled, her clothes stained with blood, her face pale and streaked with tears. Her eyes darted nervously as she took a tentative step forward, fear evident in every movement. Ethan's grip on his rifle tightened, but he didn't raise it. His mind raced to process the situation. A woman, bloodied, frightened, emerged from the dark corner of his barn, and his world tilted further into the unknown. I'm sorry," the woman said, her voice trembling. "I didn't know where else to go." Ethan remained silent for a moment, trying to make sense of it all. His gaze flickered between the baby in Luna's care and the woman now standing before him. Was she the baby's mother? But how had she ended up here? And what had brought her to this remote, isolated ranch? The woman stepped closer, her eyes fixed on the baby, and Ethan noticed the deep pain in her gaze. She looked at the child with a mixture of fear and something else, something more primal. Something that spoke of a deep need to protect. "That's my son," the woman whispered, her voice breaking as she dropped to her knees beside Luna and the baby. Her hands trembled as she reached out to touch the child. The same child Ethan had been staring at in disbelief only moments before. "That's Noah, my baby." Ethan swallowed hard, his thoughts racing. The child, Noah, belonged to this woman. And somehow, against all odds, she had found her way to his barn, to his ranch. The questions surged in his mind, but he couldn't form them into words. He had no idea who this woman was, or how she had ended up here. But one thing was clear, she was in trouble. Deep trouble. The woman's hands shook as she cradled the baby, her tears falling onto his tiny face. Ethan had never seen a woman so broken, so desperate. Her eyes, dark and filled with fear, locked with his. "I'm Rachel," she whispered, the words barely audible. "I don't know where to go. Please help me. I'm running from him. I can't go back. He'll hurt us." Rachel's words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He'll hurt us. Who was she talking about? Her fear was palpable, and Ethan could sense that this wasn't just a case of bad luck. This was something far darker. Something far more dangerous. Ethan's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. But one thing stood out above all else: Rachel and Noah were in grave danger. And despite all the uncertainty, despite the chaos of the situation, Ethan knew he couldn't just turn her away. "You're safe here," he said, his voice steady, though inside, he was still struggling to understand what was happening. "You and your son, you don't have to worry anymore. I'll protect you." Rachel looked at him, Her eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. "You'll protect us?" she repeated, as if trying to comprehend the words. "Why would you help us? You don't even know me." Ethan hesitated. He didn't know her. He didn't know her past. Or her story. But something deep inside told him that he couldn't turn his back on her. "Not now. Because you need help," Ethan said simply. "And I'm not about to let anyone hurt you. Especially not here." The woman, Rachel, nodded slowly, her tears continuing to fall. But there was a small flicker of relief in her eyes. She wasn't alone anymore. Ethan looked down at the baby. Noah, his tiny form now calm in Rachel's arms. He didn't know how or why this had happened. But he knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning of something that would change everything. Ethan protects Rachel and Noah, continued. The weight of Rachel's words hung in the air like an unspoken promise. Ethan had lived through enough loss to recognize despair when he saw it. And Rachel's face, the fear, the exhaustion, the silent plea for help, told him everything. Whoever she was running from, she had no place else to turn. But now, she had found refuge, and he wasn't about to let that slip away. He helped her to her feet, his hand gentle on her arm as if afraid she might break under the weight of her own pain. "Come on, let's get you inside," he said, his voice softer now, trying to offer her some semblance of comfort. Rachel hesitated, glancing at the baby cradled in her arms, her eyes flicking nervously to the barn door as though she were afraid someone might be lurking outside. She nodded slowly, a faint tremor running through her body. She looked at Luna, the dog now lying peacefully beside the pups. And for a moment, Rachel's gaze softened. "Thank you," she whispered to the dog, as though understanding that Luna had given her child something even more precious than protection, safety. Ethan guided her into the house, the door creaking as it opened into the quiet warmth of the kitchen. Ms. Martha, who had been quietly preparing dinner, looked up in surprise at the sight of Rachel and Noah, but her expression quickly softened as she took in the vulnerable woman and the tiny baby in her arms. "Who's this?" Ms. Martha asked, her voice low and cautious, yet welcoming. "This is Rachel," Ethan said, his tone firm, reassuring. "She and her son are staying here. They're not going anywhere." Rachel seemed to shrink under the weight of the situation, her eyes wide, taking in the old house that seemed too warm for someone who had been living in fear for so long. She didn't know what to expect next. But at least here, she wasn't alone. For the first time in days, she felt a flicker of safety, however fleeting it might be. Ms. Martha nodded, her hands instinctively reaching for a warm towel, offering it to Rachel. "Sit, child," she said, her voice as kind as ever. "I'll get you something to eat. You look like you haven't had a decent meal in days." Rachel didn't argue, and she slowly lowered herself into a chair at the kitchen table, her hands shaking as she cradled Noah. Ethan pulled out a chair next to her, sitting down but keeping his distance. He wasn't sure what to say, how to make this all feel less surreal. The strange twist of fate that had led her here, his ranch. This place that had once been full of laughter, now became the backdrop to an unexpected story. Ethan leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "You said you were running from someone." He started cautiously. "Who?" Rachel's eyes darkened, and she bit her lip, as though struggling to find the words. "His name is Derek Lawson," she finally said, her voice trembling. "He's my ex. He's dangerous, Ethan. I thought he would change. I thought maybe, just maybe, he could stop hurting me. But he never did. When I got pregnant, he said he'd throw my baby away. I ran before it was too late." Ethan's jaw tightened at the mention of Derek's name. The coldness in Rachel's eyes was enough to tell him everything about the kind of man Derek was: manipulative, controlling, and cruel. "You don't need to worry about him anymore," Ethan said firmly. "He won't get to you. Not while I'm here." Rachel looked up at him, her eyes filled with disbelief. "You don't know what he's capable of. He has connections, and he's ruthless. If he finds me, I don't know what will happen." Ethan's face hardened, his protective instincts kicking into overdrive. He didn't know the man Rachel was talking about, but he knew enough to understand that whatever Derek Lawson was willing to do, it wasn't going to be good. But that didn't matter. Not anymore. "Then we make sure he never finds you," Ethan replied, his voice steady, a quiet strength behind the words. "You'll stay here, and I'll handle it. You and Noah are safe now." Rachel's shoulders sagged in relief as if she had been carrying the weight of 1,000 burdens. And now, someone was finally offering to share the load. The tears started to fall then. Quietly at first, until she was sobbing openly. Ethan felt his heart twist at the sight of her. The rawness of the fear and pain she had been through. The uncertainty that had clung to her every step. He stood and walked over to her, placing a hand on her shoulder, tentative, unsure, but offering what he could. "You're not alone anymore," he said, his voice a gentle anchor in the storm that had been her life for so long. For a long moment, Rachel didn't speak, her tears falling in silence. Finally, she whispered, "Thank you for believing in me." Ethan's heart clenched, but he didn't say anything. There was nothing more to say. He had already made up his mind. He wasn't going to let anyone hurt her. No one would take Noah from her. Not while he was alive to stand guard. Outside, the evening sky was darkening. The stars slowly beginning to dot the night above Sunridge Ranch. The quiet hum of the ranch, once so isolating and empty, now felt like a shield. A place of refuge. But even as peace settled over the house, Ethan knew that peace would be fleeting. Derek Lawson wasn't someone who would give up easily. And whatever he had done to Rachel, it was clear that he was a man who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. And that meant Ethan had to be ready. As he stood there, watching Rachel and Noah, something deep inside him stirred, a renewed sense of purpose. He had never known that this was the path he would take. Never known that his life would be about protecting someone else. But here he was, and he would do whatever it took to keep them safe. No one would threaten his family, not while he still had a breath left to fight. Ethan faces the threat. The days that followed were filled with a quiet, uneasy calm. Sunridge Ranch, once a place of solitude and desolation, now carried an undercurrent of tension. Rachel and Noah had settled into a fragile sense of safety. The warmth of the house, the comfort of home-cooked meals, and the peace that came with being away from the dangers of the outside world were all Rachel had ever longed for. But Ethan knew better. This peace was only temporary. Derek Lawson was out there, and he wouldn't stop until he had what he wanted. Ethan had made sure of it. He had reinforced the doors, checked the locks, and ensured every window was secure. The ranch, so vast and open, had always been an advantage in its isolation. But now, it felt like a trap. He couldn't be sure when Derek would show up. But Ethan was prepared to make sure it wouldn't be on his watch. The next few days passed in a blur of normalcy and quiet. Rachel, though still haunted by her past, began to adjust. She spent most of her time with Noah, caring for him, feeding him, and watching him grow. Ethan could see the spark of a mother's love returning to her eyes. But he also saw the constant shadow of fear, like a specter lingering just out of reach. Rachel wouldn't let herself relax, not completely. Every knock at the door made her flinch. Every car that passed by the ranch made her tense. Ethan could feel it, too. It wasn't just the fear of a man on the run. It was the fear of a life that had been stolen from her. The life she had once known, one of love, of safety, of future dreams, had been shattered by Derek Lawson. And now, she was living in the shadow of that broken past. One evening, as Ethan and Rachel sat in the kitchen, the low hum of the stove the only sound in the room, Ethan's instincts suddenly flared. He looked out the window over the sink, his eyes narrowing as a shadow passed across the driveway. A vehicle, a truck, slow moving, with its headlights off. He could barely make out the shape of the vehicle in the fading light. But he knew what it was. He knew the threat was real. Derek had come for them. "Stay here," Ethan ordered, his voice low but filled with urgency. "Don't open the door for anyone. Do you hear me?" Rachel looked at him, her face pale. She had seen the shift in his expression, the determination that had taken hold of him. This was it, the moment she had feared for so long. Derek was here. "I'll be fine," Rachel said, but her voice trembled. "Ethan, don't do anything reckless. We can call the police." Ethan shook his head, his eyes never leaving the window. "The police won't get here in time," he said. "We have to be ready. Lock the door. Stay out of sight." Rachel's chest tightened, but she didn't argue. She stood up and moved to Noah's crib, gently adjusting the blanket around him. She kissed his forehead softly, whispering words of comfort to him, before locking the door behind her and retreating into the back room. As Ethan had instructed, Ethan grabbed his rifle and moved silently toward the front door, his boots heavy on the wooden floors. His every movement was deliberate, each step calculated. He had no intention of letting Derek get anywhere near Rachel or Noah. He knew Derek would stop at nothing. The man was dangerous, ruthless, but so was Ethan. As he reached the porch, he paused, listening. The truck had stopped, the engine was silent, and the only sound was the distant chirp of crickets in the Texas night. Ethan's grip on his rifle tightened. His breath slowed. He knew this was the moment. Then, a voice broke the silence. "Ethan Carter." Derek's voice rang out, sharp and cutting through the still air. "I know you're in there. You can't hide forever." Ethan's heart raced, but his face remained impassive. He had known this was coming. And he was ready. He stepped into the shadows, his silhouette barely visible against the darkened porch. He wasn't going to make it easy for Derek to find him. "You've got no right to be here," Ethan called back, his voice steady and strong. "You've got no claim on her anymore." Derek laughed, the sound cold and menacing. "You think you can protect her? You think you can keep her safe here? I'm not leaving until I get what's mine." Ethan's jaw clenched. He could feel the anger bubbling inside him. But he kept it in check. He had to stay focused. This wasn't just about protecting Rachel. It was about making sure Derek never threatened his family again. Without another word, Ethan stepped out from the shadows. Rifle aimed, his voice now sharp with authority. "Stay away from my ranch. Derek, you don't want to make this a fight." For a moment, there was silence. Then Derek stepped forward from the shadows of his truck, his figure coming into view. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face hard with malice. He smiled as he took a step closer, his hands raised in mock surrender. "I don't want to fight, Ethan," Derek said, his voice smooth, but the venom was evident beneath the surface. "I just want my son." Ethan's grip tightened on the rifle. He wasn't going to let this man near Rachel or Noah. Not now. Not ever. "This isn't your son anymore," Ethan said, his voice low. "Dangerous. You gave up that right the moment you laid a hand on her. And you'll never touch him." Derek's smile faded, replaced by a look of rage. He took a step forward. And Ethan didn't hesitate. He raised the rifle slightly, his stance unyielding. "I'm giving you one chance to leave," Ethan said, his voice a low growl. "Walk away, Derek, before this gets worse for you." Derek's eyes narrowed, his fingers twitching near his waistband as if reaching for something. But Ethan was faster. He knew what he had to do. He wasn't about to let Derek take anything from him, not his peace. Not his family. Not his future. "You'll regret this," Derek spat, but before he could take another step, Ethan pulled the trigger, sending a warning shot into the dirt at Derek's feet. Derek froze, his eyes wide with disbelief. But he didn't move closer. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. But his hands were steady. He had made his choice. He wasn't backing down. Derek turned and, without another word, retreated toward his truck. His tires screeched as he sped away, disappearing into the dark horizon. Ethan stood there for a moment, his breath heavy, his mind racing. He had done it. For now, Rachel and Noah were safe. But he knew this wasn't over. It was just the beginning. The calm before the storm. The next morning, the sun rose over Sunridge Ranch, casting long golden rays across the fields. The tranquility of the landscape seemed to mock the chaos of the night before. But Ethan wasn't fooled. He had seen the way Derek had looked at him, the rage that had filled his eyes. That was only a taste of the danger that was coming their way. Ethan knew he couldn't afford to let his guard down. Not now. Not when Rachel and Noah were still vulnerable. He had spent the morning checking the property, walking the fences, and ensuring every perimeter was secure. He couldn't shake the image of Derek standing on his porch, eyes dark with malice, promising that this wasn't over. And Ethan had no doubt it wasn't. Derek Lawson was the kind of man who would never let go of what he thought was his. And Rachel had made the mistake of thinking she could outrun him. But Derek wasn't the kind of man you could escape from. Ethan paused as he walked toward the barn, Luna at his side. The dog's usual energy seemed subdued, as though she, too, could sense the storm that was brewing. The ranch had always been a quiet place, a place of peace and solitude. But now it felt like a powder keg. Everything felt on edge. He looked over at the barn, the place where the unimaginable had happened, the baby, the woman, the secrets that still lingered. As he approached the house, Rachel stepped onto the porch, holding Noah in her arms. She looked tired, her face pale, but there was a glimmer of something in her eyes, something that hadn't been there when she first arrived. It wasn't exactly hope, but it was a small spark. A sign that she was beginning to trust again. Ethan could see the way she held Noah. The way she moved with him. It was clear that she had begun to heal. At least a little. But the shadow of fear still loomed over her. He couldn't imagine what it had been like to live with that kind of constant terror. Always looking over your shoulder. Always wondering when the man you had once loved would come for you. For your child. He stepped up to the porch. His boots quiet on the wooden floor. "How's he doing?" Ethan asked, nodding toward the baby in her arms. Rachel smiled softly, her eyes lighting up with a tenderness that made Ethan's heart tighten. "He's fine. He's growing. It's like he's a part of me now. Like he's always been here," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I never thought I'd be able to have a child after everything. But now, holding him, it feels like, maybe there's a chance for something good." Ethan nodded, trying to keep his emotions in check. He didn't know how to respond to that. He wasn't a man who shared his feelings easily. But in that moment, he understood Rachel more than words could say. The pain of losing someone you loved. The grief of having your life turned upside down by a person you once trusted. It was something Ethan knew all too well. "You're safe here, Rachel," Ethan said, his voice low but firm. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you or him. I promised, and I intend to keep that promise." Rachel looked up at him, her eyes searching his face as though trying to read him, to understand if he really meant it. And when he nodded, her lips parted, and she took a step forward, moving closer to him. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "for everything. I don't know what I would have done without you. I thought I was going to lose him. Lose everything. But now, I have a chance. A real chance." Ethan didn't know what to say to that. There was nothing he could say that would take away the fear. The trauma. The scars that Rachel carried. But he could offer her safety. He could offer her a place to heal. He could offer her something that she hadn't had in a long time, a sense of stability. Even if just for a little while. But as he looked at her, holding Noah so gently, the thought gnawed at him, this peace, this calm, couldn't last forever. Derek Lawson would come for them again. And when he did, Ethan would have to make sure that Rachel and Noah were ready. They couldn't afford to be caught off guard again. The afternoon passed in a quiet lull. The world outside seemingly unaffected by the tension that lay within the walls of the ranch. Ethan and Rachel worked together, tending to the house, making preparations for the days ahead. There was a sense of routine, of normalcy. But neither of them could shake the feeling that something was coming. As evening fell, the sky darkening with the approaching night, Ethan stood on the porch, gazing out over the ranch. The house behind him was quiet, and Rachel had retreated to her room to rest, the baby sleeping soundly in her arms. He was lost in thought. But then the sound of an engine broke his concentration. A vehicle, slow and deliberate, was approaching from the distant road. Ethan's body tensed instinctively. He knew that sound. It was the sound of trouble. His hand went to his rifle before he even consciously thought about it. He stepped off the porch, moving toward the driveway, his heart hammering in his chest. Was it Derek? Had he finally come? He didn't know, but he was ready. He had to be. The truck slowed as it neared the gate, and Ethan's pulse quickened. This time, he wouldn't let anyone threaten his family. This time, he was prepared to face whatever came through that gate. But as the vehicle stopped, the figure behind the wheel didn't look like Derek. It wasn't Derek. It was someone else, someone he hadn't expected. Unforeseen confrontation. The truck came to a slow stop just beyond the ranch's gate, the dust swirling around it as it idled, creating a haze of uncertainty in the air. Ethan's hand instinctively tightened on the rifle's stock as he took a step forward, his boots crunching on the gravel driveway. His eyes were fixed on the truck, watching the figure behind the wheel, trying to make sense of who it could be. The truck wasn't familiar. The engine cut off, leaving a heavy silence hanging in the air. Ethan's gaze never wavered, scanning the vehicle and the driver with a careful, practiced eye. It wasn't the same sense of rage he'd seen when Derek stood in front of him. But something else lingered, something. The door to the truck creaked open, and a tall man in his mid-40s stepped out. His face was weathered, hard, but there was a calm to him that made Ethan uneasy. He was dressed in a faded leather jacket, his posture confident but not threatening. Ethan's grip on the rifle remained steady, his mind racing to connect the dots. This man, whoever he was, was no stranger. He could feel it in the way he carried himself. As the man closed the truck door behind him, he finally spoke, his voice low but clear. "You must be Ethan Carter," he said, his eyes scanning the ranch like he was taking inventory, calculating everything. Ethan didn't respond right away. He wasn't about to lower his guard, not for a second. Instead, he kept his rifle ready, but aimed low, a silent warning. "Who are you?" Ethan's voice cut through the quiet evening, sharp and demanding. The man smiled, though it was a tight, controlled expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Name's Jack Foster," he said, taking a step toward Ethan, his boots crunching against the gravel with deliberate slowness. "I've been tracking a certain woman for a while now. Rachel Evans." Ethan's muscles tightened at the mention of Rachel's name. His jaw clenched, and his free hand reached up to wipe the beads of sweat forming at his temple. The last thing he needed was someone else coming to this ranch looking for Rachel. He had made it clear that no one was welcome to threaten her here. "No one. What do you want with her?" Ethan asked, his voice a low growl. "You're not welcome here." Jack Foster stopped a few feet away from Ethan, his eyes glimmering with something unreadable. He didn't seem fazed by the rifle in Ethan's hands. Instead, he regarded Ethan with an almost calculating calmness. "I'm not here to cause trouble, Ethan," he said, his voice still even, "but I need to talk to Rachel. She's in danger, and I'm the only one who can help her." Ethan's eyes narrowed, the weight of Jack's words settling in his gut like a rock. Rachel had only just begun to trust him, to find some kind of peace. The last thing he wanted was someone else pulling her back into the chaos. "What kind of danger are you talking about?" Ethan demanded, his voice rising slightly. He couldn't afford to let his emotions get the better of him. Jack sighed, as if he were disappointed by Ethan's lack of understanding. "Derek Lawson," he said simply. "You don't know the whole story. Rachel's running from a man who's got a lot more power than you think. And that power's going to catch up to her eventually. You can't protect her forever." Ethan's grip on the rifle tightened. "I'll decide who gets to stay or leave here. And I'll decide who protects Rachel." Jack's eyes flashed briefly, and for a second, Ethan saw a flicker of something more dangerous in his eyes. But then the moment passed, and Jack raised his hands slightly in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to fight you, Ethan, but you're right. I'm not going anywhere until I make sure Rachel's safe. She's been living in fear for too long, and it's time we put an end to it." Ethan felt a surge of frustration. The last thing Rachel needed was more people from her past showing up, dragging her back into the nightmare she had worked so hard to escape. He stepped forward, lowering his rifle slightly but keeping it in his hands. He wasn't about to let Jack Foster get too close, especially not after hearing what he had to say about Derek. "Rachel doesn't need your help," Ethan snapped. "She's safe here with me. And if you think you can just waltz in here and tell me what to do, you're wrong." Jack didn't flinch. He met Ethan's glare with a quiet steadiness. "I didn't say she needed me," he replied, his voice softer now, but still firm. "I said she needs help. You can't keep her hidden forever. Derek won't stop until he gets what he wants. And if you don't believe me, you're going to learn the hard way." Ethan's mind was spinning. He wasn't sure who Jack Foster was. But one thing was clear. This man wasn't just some stranger looking to cause trouble. There was something deeper, something more urgent behind his words. He could see it in Jack's eyes, the intensity behind them, but that didn't mean he could just let Jack waltz in and take control. He wouldn't let anyone endanger Rachel again. Not on his watch. The silence stretched between them, heavy and tense, as Ethan weighed his options. Jack wasn't leaving, that much was clear, but that didn't mean he was welcome. Finally, Ethan exhaled slowly, lowering his rifle. "You can talk to Rachel. But if you think you can force her into anything, you'll regret it." Jack nodded, his eyes never leaving Ethan's. "Fair enough," he said, his voice carrying a note of respect now. "But just remember, Ethan, I'm not the one you should be worried about. Derek's out there, and he'll stop at nothing." With that, Jack turned and started toward the house, his steps deliberate. Ethan stood there, his heart still pounding, the weight of Jack's words settling in his chest. The storm was far from over, and it was only a matter of time before Derek Lawson showed up again. Unraveling secrets. The sun had begun to set, casting a golden hue over Sunridge Ranch. But inside, the atmosphere was far from peaceful. The tension between Ethan and Jack had not subsided since their confrontation in the yard. Rachel remained quiet, her eyes darting between the two men, as if trying to piece together what was happening. Her past, which she had hoped to leave behind, was pulling her back, one dangerous step at a time. Jack sat at the kitchen table, his hands clasped together as if he had all the time in the world. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, watching him carefully, his arms crossed. They were at an impasse, neither man trusting the other fully, yet both understanding that they needed each other if they were to protect Rachel and Noah. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Jack said again, breaking the silence, "but I need to explain a few things." Rachel stood by the counter, her back turned to the men as she cradled Noah in her arms. She had listened to their exchange, but the flood of emotions left her too overwhelmed to speak. She had spent years trying to escape Derek's grasp, but now the man who had torn her life apart had returned, in one form or another, and the last thing she wanted was to drag others into her mess. But Ethan, strong and determined, had promised to protect her, and she believed him. Still, a part of her couldn't shake the feeling that their safety was temporary. Ethan finally spoke, his voice sharp. "If you think I'm just going to let you waltz in here and tell Rachel what to do, you're mistaken." Jack met Ethan's gaze with a calm, steady look. "I'm not telling her what to do," he said, his voice low, "but you don't know the whole story. Ethan, you don't know the kind of man Derek is. He's dangerous, and Rachel's not the only one he's hurt. He's been involved in some things that go far beyond a broken relationship." Ethan didn't flinch, but he felt his curiosity piqued. "What things?" Jack hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Derek's been involved in organized crime, money laundering, illegal operations. He's used people, manipulated them, without hesitation. Rachel wasn't just some woman to him. She was leverage, and now, she's been running from him for months." Rachel's breath caught in her throat, and she turned to face the two men, her eyes wide with shock. "What?" she whispered. "How do you know that?" Jack's face softened, but his eyes remained intense. "Because I've been investigating him for a while now. After you left, I followed his trail, trying to find you. I've seen the kind of people Derek associates with, the kind of people you don't want to cross. He's dangerous, Rachel, more dangerous than you realize." Ethan's mind raced as he processed Jack's words. He had known something wasn't right about the way Derek had been so relentless in his pursuit of Rachel. But he hadn't known the full extent of it. He hadn't known that Derek's influence stretched so far, that he was tied to something as dark as organized crime. Rachel sank into a chair, her face pale. She didn't know how to react. Her past had been a tangled mess of lies, manipulation, and abuse, but hearing it laid out so plainly, hearing the scope of Derek's actions, left her reeling. "I never wanted this for him," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never wanted him to become that monster." Ethan sat down next to her, his presence a silent comfort as he placed a hand on her shoulder. "You didn't make him who he is," he said softly. "He made those choices, not you." Jack watched the exchange quietly, his expression softening. "Rachel, I know you think you've been running your whole life, but you can't outrun this. Derek won't stop until he gets what he wants. And if you're going to stay here, we need to be ready for him. We need to face this head on." Ethan looked at Jack, his frustration bubbling over. "And what do you expect me to do? Huh? You show up here, you throw around these claims, and now I'm supposed to just trust you? You think Rachel needs you to fix this?" Jack's eyes darkened. "I didn't say I'm the one who's going to fix it, but I've been keeping tabs on Derek for a long time. I know how he operates, and I know how far he's willing to go. You're not equipped to deal with him, Ethan, not like I am." Ethan clenched his fists, but Rachel, sensing the rising tension, interjected, her voice calm but firm. "Enough," she said. "I can't stand this anymore. I've been running for so long, trying to keep my son safe. And now I'm here, stuck in this nightmare again. I need to know the truth. I need to know what kind of danger I'm facing." Jack's eyes softened as he met Rachel's gaze. He knew how much it cost her to face her past, but there was no turning back now. He had come here to help, and whether Ethan liked it or not, they had to work together if they were going to survive Derek's wrath. "I'm sorry," Jack said quietly, "but the truth is, Derek won't just walk away. He'll come for you, Rachel, and if we're not ready, he'll destroy everything you've worked for. Everything." Ethan's protective instincts flared, and for a moment, He saw nothing but the image of Derek. That dark, dangerous figure who had threatened his family. The man who had come so close to taking Rachel away from him. And now, he had to protect her, no matter what it took. "We'll be ready," Ethan said, his voice low and unwavering. "I don't care what you've done, Jack, but if you think for 1 second I'm going to let Derek hurt Rachel or Noah, you're wrong. I'll fight him. I'll fight anyone who tries to hurt them." Rachel looked between the two men, her heart pounding. She could feel the weight of the decisions ahead, the danger closing in, but for the first time in a long time, she felt something more than fear. She felt a small flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to face this alone. The storm wasn't over, but for the first time, Rachel didn't feel like she was running away anymore. This time, she was going to stand and fight. The calm before the final showdown. The days following Jack's revelation passed in a tense silence. Sunridge Ranch, which had once felt like a safe haven, now seemed like a fragile shell, waiting to be shattered. The quietness that had settled over the place was thick with anticipation. Everyone knew that the storm was coming, but none of them were sure exactly when it would hit. Ethan spent hours each day securing the property. He double-checked the gates, reinforced the windows, and made sure every corner of the ranch was as protected as possible. He couldn't afford to be complacent, not when Derek was out there. Not when Rachel and Noah's safety depended on him. Rachel, too, had fallen into a routine. Despite her fears, she refused to let them control her. She spent time with Noah, taking solace in his innocent smile and tiny hands. He was the one bright spot in this nightmare, and Rachel clung to that. Yet, no matter how much she tried to focus on her son, her mind often wandered back to Derek, the man who had once promised to love her, only to become a monster who used his power to manipulate and control. She had hoped that running away would give her a fresh start. But now, the past had caught up with her in the form of Jack Foster, and the specter of Derek's violence loomed large. One afternoon, as Ethan was walking the grounds, Rachel sat on the porch, cradling Noah in her arms. The baby's soft coos filled the air, and for a moment, the world outside seemed to fall away. Rachel rocked him gently, breathing in the peacefulness of the ranch, trying to convince herself that everything would be okay. But deep down, she knew the truth. The calm before the storm was just that, calm. And soon, the storm would arrive. Jack had left earlier in the day, heading into town to gather more information on Derek's whereabouts. He had a plan, but Rachel could see the worry in his eyes. He wasn't fooling anyone. Derek was no ordinary man, and Jack's quiet confidence couldn't mask the fear that had taken root inside him. Derek's reach was vast, and his power was something even Jack couldn't ignore. Ethan returned from his patrol just as the sun began to set, casting an orange glow across the land. He paused at the top of the porch steps, his eyes catching Rachel's. She looked tired, but there was something different about her today. Something resolute. "How's he doing?" Ethan asked, his voice low. Rachel glanced down at Noah, who had drifted off to sleep in her arms. "He's fine. He's always fine," she said, her voice softer than usual. Ethan stepped onto the porch, sitting down beside her. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, with emotions neither of them had fully voiced yet. Rachel looked at Ethan, seeing the tension in his jaw, the way his eyes searched the horizon, as if looking for a threat that could emerge at any moment. "Do you think we can really protect him?" Rachel asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think we can keep Noah safe from Derek?" Ethan looked at her, his face unreadable. He hadn't been able to give her an answer to that question before. But now, with the weight of her fear hanging in the air, he spoke, his voice steady. "I don't know what Derek's capable of, but I do know this. I'll fight him. I'll do whatever it takes to protect you both." Rachel took a deep breath, her eyes filling with tears she refused to let fall. "I don't want him to grow up like I did," she murmured, her voice trembling. "I want him to have a chance. Ethan, a chance to be happy, to be free." Ethan's hand reached out, gently resting on her shoulder. He knew that Rachel's fears ran deeper than just Derek's threat. It was the fear of a life that had been stolen from her. The fear that Noah would grow up in a world full of the same violence and pain she had known. "You'll give him that chance," Ethan said, his voice firm with the promise. "I won't let anything happen to him. I won't let anything happen to you." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind whispered through the trees, and the only sound was the distant call of a bird. Ethan could feel the weight of Rachel's gaze on him, but he didn't look at her. He was focused on the horizon, knowing that the peace they had was only temporary. Jack returned later that evening, his face grim. He didn't have much to say, only that Derek was getting closer. His network of contacts had traced Derek's movements, and they were closing in on the ranch. "We don't have much time," Jack said, his voice tight with urgency. "He's coming." Ethan stood up, his jaw set with determination. "Then we'll be ready for him." That night, as Rachel lay in bed with Noah asleep in the crib beside her, the reality of the situation settled in. Ethan was right. Derek was coming, and all the preparations in the world might not be enough to stop him. But Rachel refused to let fear rule her anymore. She had survived so much. And now, for the first time in a long while, she had a family, a reason to keep fighting. And with Ethan by her side, she knew that, no matter what, they would face the storm together. The final confrontation. The air was thick with tension the next morning as Ethan, Rachel, and Jack prepared for the inevitable. The calm they had clung to for so long had shattered the moment Jack had returned with the news that Derek was closer than ever. The final confrontation was upon them, and there was no more time to prepare, no more time to hide. Ethan stood by the front door, his rifle in hand, his mind racing. Jack had gone to secure the perimeter, ensuring that every escape route was blocked off. Ethan had made the decision. There was no running from Derek anymore. They would face him head-on, protect Rachel and Noah, and end this once and for all. He couldn't let Derek destroy everything he had built, everything he had fought for. Rachel stood by the window, her hands trembling as she looked out at the dusty road that led up to the ranch. She could feel the weight of what was about to happen pressing down on her chest. The baby, safe in her arms, was the only thing keeping her grounded. She had come to love this place, this home that she and Noah had found. But now, the threat of losing it all was more real than ever. "Ethan," Rachel said quietly, her voice strained with emotion. "I'm scared." Ethan's heart tightened at the vulnerability in her words. He stepped toward her, gently taking Noah from her arms and cradling him for a moment. "I know," he said softly, "but we're not alone in this. We'll face him together. You're not running anymore, Rachel. This ends today." Outside, the distant rumble of a truck echoed through the quiet morning. Ethan's senses went on high alert, his grip tightening on the rifle. He knew that sound. It was Derek's truck. Jack's voice called out from the porch. A low warning. "He's here." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She had never expected it would end this way, standing here, waiting for the man who had tortured her life to arrive on their doorstep. The fear that had lived inside her for so long was now a palpable thing, gnawing at her. But she stood firm. For Noah, for Ethan. The truck slowed as it approached, its headlights cutting through the dim morning light. Derek's vehicle came into view, and with it, the dark figure she had hoped never to see again. Derek's face was just as cold and calculating as she remembered, his eyes locked onto the ranch as if he already saw it as his prize. Ethan stepped forward, rifle in hand, ready to meet Derek head-on. He wasn't about to let this man hurt Rachel or Noah. He wouldn't let Derek take anything from him. He had made a promise. Derek pulled up just beyond the gate, the engine sputtering to a halt. He stepped out of the truck with a smug smile, his hands raised in mock surrender. Well, Ethan, I see you've made yourself quite comfortable here." Derek's voice oozed with contempt. Ethan's jaw clenched, but he held his ground. "You're not welcome here, Derek. You should turn around and leave." Derek chuckled darkly, taking a step toward him. "You think you can stop me? You think you can keep her hidden forever? Rachel belongs with me, and I'll do whatever it takes to get her back." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "She's not yours anymore," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "And if you don't leave now, you'll regret it." Derek took another step forward, his expression hardening. "You're out of your league, Carter. I've got power. You have nothing." Ethan raised the rifle slightly, the barrel pointed at the ground but ready to move at a moment's notice. "You're wrong," he said firmly. "I have everything I need to protect them." For a moment, time seemed to stretch, the tension thick between them. But then, in a flash, Derek lunged, reaching for something hidden beneath his jacket. Ethan's instincts kicked in. He fired a warning shot, the blast splitting the air. Derek stopped in his tracks, his hand dropping to his side. "I said, leave." Ethan warned again, his voice cold, unyielding. Derek's eyes blazed with fury. But there was something else, fear. Ethan knew Derek understood that this time. There was no escape. His threats, his power, they had no sway here anymore. Ethan wasn't backing down. Not this time. Derek took one last look at Ethan. His face twisted in anger. Without another word, he turned and retreated to his truck. The tires squealed as he sped away, the dust settling in his wake. Ethan stood there for a moment, the rifle still clutched tightly in his hands. It was over, at least for now. He turned to Rachel, who was standing in the doorway, watching him with wide eyes. "You're safe," he said, his voice softer now, the tension slowly melting away. Rachel stepped forward, her relief overwhelming. "I don't know what to say." "Ethan, you don't have to say anything," Ethan replied, pulling her into his arms. "I made a promise." As the sound of Derek's truck faded into the distance, Rachel allowed herself to relax for the first time in what felt like years. She wasn't running anymore. She was home. A new beginning. The day after Derek's departure was eerily quiet. The ranch, which had been filled with the tension of the past few days, seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The morning sun broke through the clouds, casting warm light across the land. It was as though the universe itself was offering them a fresh start, a new beginning. Ethan stood by the barn, his hands resting on the wooden fence, staring out at the fields that stretched for miles. The distant sound of birds chirping and the rustle of the wind in the trees filled the air. It felt peaceful, almost surreal, considering everything they had been through. For the first time in what felt like forever, he could breathe without looking over his shoulder, without wondering when the next danger would strike. Rachel stood beside him, her hand gently resting on Noah's back as she pushed the stroller along the dirt path. She looked at the vast expanse of the ranch, taking in the beauty of it all. The storm that had raged in her life for so long had finally passed. And for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that she could be happy again. She had her son, her home, and now, she had Ethan. "Is it really over?" Rachel asked, her voice soft as she watched Ethan's profile. "I mean, for good?" Ethan turned to look at her, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I don't know, Rachel. Derek's not the kind of man to stay down for long. But I can promise you one thing. We'll be ready, and we'll face whatever comes together." Rachel nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle in her chest. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew that with Ethan by her side, she could handle anything. The fear that had once gripped her heart began to loosen, replaced by a quiet strength she hadn't known she still possessed. "I never thought I'd feel safe again," Rachel said, her voice filled with wonder. "But here I am, and I'm actually starting to believe it." Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch reassuring and steady. "You deserve to feel safe, Rachel, and you deserve to have a future. A peaceful one. That's what I'm going to make sure of. No more running." Rachel smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes, lighting up her face. "And what about you, Ethan? What do you want?" Ethan took a deep breath, his gaze softening as he looked down at Noah, who was now playing in the dirt, his small hands busy exploring the world around him. The sight of the child, so innocent and full of life, reminded him of everything he had fought for, of everything he still had to live for. "I want this," Ethan said, his voice filled with conviction. "I want this life, this home. I want to be here, with you and Noah. I want to keep protecting you both. This, what we have right now, it's all I need." Rachel's heart swelled as she looked at him, feeling a warmth that she hadn't felt in years. She had been through so much. But in that moment, she realized that she had found something far more precious than safety. She had found love, and the strength to face the future with someone who truly cared about her and her son. "I want that too," she said softly, her voice full of emotion. "I want to be here with you. I want Noah to grow up knowing that he's loved and safe. And I want to make sure we never have to live in fear again." Ethan smiled, his eyes warm and full of promise. He took her hand, squeezing it gently. "We're in this together," he said, his words steady and reassuring. "And we'll build a life here, one day at a time." As the afternoon wore on, Ethan and Rachel worked together, their movements synchronized as they took care of the tasks around the ranch. For the first time, there was no fear in their hearts, no weight on their shoulders. They were free from the shadows that had once haunted them. Later that evening, as the sun set and the sky turned a brilliant shade of purple. Ethan and Rachel sat on the porch with Noah, watching as the stars began to appear. The air was cool, the night settling in with a peaceful quiet that they hadn't known for so long. "This is our new beginning," Rachel said, her voice filled with quiet wonder. Ethan nodded, his arm wrapped around her shoulders, holding her close. "Yeah," he said softly, "this is just the start." And as they sat there, surrounded by the land they had come to love, with Noah asleep in his arms and the promise of a future full of hope, Ethan realized that no matter what came next, they would face it together. They had found something worth fighting for, something worth holding on to. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had finally found their peace. Unseen threats. The months that followed Derek's departure had been peaceful. Sunridge Ranch had become a place of solace, a home for Rachel, Ethan, and Noah. The weight of the past had begun to fade, replaced by the quiet joys of everyday life. Ethan and Rachel worked together to maintain the ranch, building a future they could be proud of. Noah, growing more curious by the day, brought laughter and light into their lives. But even in the quietest moments, something lingered, a nagging feeling that not everything was as it seemed. While Derek had been driven away, Rachel couldn't shake the fear that it wasn't truly over. The peace they had fought for felt fragile, like it could be shattered at any moment. One late afternoon, as Ethan worked on repairing the barn door, Rachel sat on the porch with Noah. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the land. The air was cool and crisp, the sky painted with hues of orange and pink. For a moment, it felt like they had finally found the peace they deserved. But then, Rachel noticed something, a figure, just beyond the line of trees at the edge of the property. She squinted, trying to make out who it was. But the figure vanished as quickly as it appeared. Her heart skipped a beat. She stood up, holding Noah a little tighter. She hadn't seen anyone in the area for weeks, and the sight of a figure standing so close to the trees unsettled her. "Ethan," Rachel called out, her voice shaking. Ethan turned from his work, his eyes scanning the distance as Rachel's words echoed through the air. He immediately noticed the same unease in her expression. He knew something was wrong. "What is it?" he asked, walking toward her. "I saw someone," she replied, her voice trembling, "by the trees, just standing there. They disappeared before I could get a good look." Ethan's eyes narrowed, his protective instincts kicking in. He knew Rachel was still haunted by Derek's threats, but this felt different. The figure had been too close, too deliberate. "Stay inside," Ethan ordered, his voice firm. "Lock the door. I'll check it out." Rachel hesitated but nodded, not wanting to argue. She kissed Noah on the forehead before heading inside, her mind racing. The thought of another threat was unbearable. Had Derek sent someone after them? Or was this something else entirely? Ethan made his way toward the trees, his heart pounding in his chest. The ranch was quiet, too quiet. As he moved through the thick underbrush, he scanned every shadow, every movement. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but his instincts told him something wasn't right. As he reached the edge of the trees, he paused. Nothing, no sign of anyone. The silence was unnerving, but just as he was about to turn back, a movement caught his eye, a flash of something in the distance, disappearing behind a small hill. Ethan's heart raced. Whoever it was, they weren't far, and they were watching. With a renewed sense of urgency, he moved quickly, following the trail, but by the time he reached the top of the hill, the figure was gone. The ranch was silent once more, but Ethan knew something was amiss. He made his way back to the house, his mind in overdrive, the feeling of being watched, of danger lurking just out of sight. Gnawed at him. When he returned to the porch, Rachel was waiting for him, her face pale with worry. "Did you find anything?" she asked, her voice tight. Ethan shook his head. "No one was there when I got to the trees. But I saw something, someone moving. They're still out there. I'll have to keep an eye on it." Rachel's fear mirrored his own. "Do you think it's Derek? Or someone else?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure who it was, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that something was about to disrupt the life they had fought so hard to build. "I don't know," he finally said, "but we'll be ready." As the night fell and the darkness enveloped the ranch, Ethan stayed alert, keeping watch from the porch. The peace they had once found now felt like it was slipping away. replaced by the haunting certainty that the threat they had escaped wasn't truly gone. Somewhere out there, someone was watching them, and whatever came next, they would have to face it together.